Good morning, church. May the many, many possibilities of God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer be with you. And also, hear the good news. No eye has yet seen, nor ear has yet heard, and no mind has yet imagined all that God has prepared for us. Today, we will go in search of that God-prepared abundance. I'm Linda Jaramillo, Executive Minister of Justice and Witness Ministries, and it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to Suncoast Saturday, a day to explore big ideas, best practices, a day for exploration and celebration, a day to imagine what's possible. You've heard Edith Guffey share the special events of Suncoast Saturday. She provided an excellent overview for you, and you have your Suncoast Saturdays guide with you, I hope, because it has all the detailed information you will need and is scheduled to help you for most of the day. This morning, we are graced and delighted to begin with a keynote address from one of America's greatest thinkers and writers and commentators, one who claims the United Church of Christ as his very own. Leonard Pitts, Jr. is the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Miami Herald, where his writing appears every Sunday and Wednesday, but his nationally syndicated column also finds its way into many of the country's largest and most respected newspapers. It was September 11, 2001, when Leonard Pitts, Jr. wrote a column that touched the hearts and the minds of this nation. His clarity resonated with readers everywhere, causing an avalanche of more than 26,000 emails. His column was posted on the internet and circulated chain letter style before the days of Facebook, and helped to bring calm, hope, and encouragement to millions of mourning and despondent people. And the next day, he would write again, this time passionately and prophetically speaking out against anti-Muslim stereotyping and scapegoating, saying this, and I quote, "If we ever let anger deliver us to the doorstep of fanaticism, extremism, intolerance, hate, then we might as well give up now, because everything that matters has already been lost," end quote. If you know or read Leonard Pitts, Jr., then you know he is a man of justice, courage, faith, and insight. He is a faithful intellectual who connects ideals with possibilities and helps us examine them from all aspects of their beautiful complexities. Originally hired by the Miami Herald to critique music, within a few years he received his own column in which he has dealt extensively with issues of race, politics, and culture. He now lives in Miami, Maryland, but Florida, for good reason, still stays strong claim on him. Leonard, and he gave me permission because he said that's what his mom named him, Leonard, is a best-selling author. His first book, Becoming Dad, Black Men and the Journey to Fatherhood, was published in 2006, and his first novel, Before I Forget, was released in 2009, earning a star review from Publishers Weekly. Also in 2009, a book of his most popular columns, Forward from This Moment, was published. It is Leonard Pitts, Jr.'s insight and intellect, his love of the church, and his passion for justice, and his Pulitzer Prize-winning popularity that emanates from here in the Sunshine State. That makes him the perfect person to speak to our General Synod theme, Imagine What's Possible. God is still speaking. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Leonard Pitts, Jr.
Good morning, UCC. I don't know how I'm going to live up to all of that, but I'm going to do my best. I thank you very much for having me here. It is always good to be home. Before I get into anything else, I think I have some friends in the audience that I would at least like to acknowledge. The Reverend Joaquin Willis and his wife, Clarissa. My former pastor is out there somewhere. And I don't know if they're here or not, but if they are here and I don't call their names, then I'm never going to hear the end of it. So also my friend, the Reverend Marvin Silver, and my friend, the Reverend Tony Hawkins, may or may not be here, and therefore may or may not hear any of this. But I thank you very much again for having me. It is always good to be. It is always good to be home. I want to spend a few moments talking about imagining what is possible. There's going to be some images on the screen. Are we going to put the images up? I usually don't work with video, and if I'd been smarter about this, I would have worked out a visual cue. There we go. There we go. I would have worked out a cue so that he would know when I wanted the images. The images that you see on screen are from the Hubble Space Telescope, and they are provided through the courtesy of NASA. I have always found the Hubble pictures to be of immense value to me when the time comes to talk of imagining possibility. There is something humbling in these images. You look at these clusters of stars, these swirls of stellar gases, these spiraling galaxies, and you realize that your entire life, every place you've ever been or known or dreamt of going, every dream you've ever had, every setback or every step forward that you have ever experienced, multiplied by the 6 billion people now sharing planet Earth with us, multiplied by all of human history, multiplied by every man, woman, boy, girl, bird, beast, insect, and bacterium that have ever lived, all of it combined together would not, on the scale of these images, be visible with the naked eye. And yet these images themselves represent but the smallest corner of God's possibility, the smallest corner of God's infinity. So I like these images because I always feel that they lend a certain perspective to the striving and running and going and doing and crying and trying that make up all of our lives. As I was contemplating what I would say to you today, I was led to a column that I wrote 9 years ago about a minister friend of mine. In order to preserve his privacy, I didn't give out his full name, but just between you and me, the minister in question was a UCC minister named the Reverend David Bowers. With your indulgence, I would like to read you the column that I wrote about David in its entirety. It said, "A preacher friend of mine has embarked upon a mission. He wants to stop people in his city, Washington, D.C., from killing each other. The minister has had his fill of the rat-a-tat-tat of city violence, that grim rhythm of drive-by shootings, innocent bystanders, weeping mothers, and caskets so small they break your heart. So he has embarked upon a crusade against murder. I am a little hazy on how it is all supposed to work, and I get the sense that David is still doping it out himself. As best I can tell, he's crusading against killing with a combination of prayer, street preaching, advocacy, dispute mediation, and moral suasion. By those means, he hopes to make murder an unknown in D.C. yet. And did I mention that he proposes to bring all of this about within 3 years? You will not be surprised to hear that some people think that the preacher is one chapter short of a complete Bible, if you catch my drift. I took him aside the other day and I said, "I know people have been telling you you're crazy." He nodded. "Well, you are," I said. "They're right." Then I pointed out to him that Martin Luther King Jr. was crazy too. After all, he surveyed a system that had been enshrined in law and custom for nearly a century and decided that without guns, with little money, with little or limited public support, and with no weapon besides righteousness, he would bring it down. We all know how that story came out. It turns out that history is replete with the triumphs and the achievements of crazy people. From George Washington defeating the mightiest military on earth with an army of farmers and tradesmen, to Mohandas Gandhi waging peaceful war against the British Empire, to Berry Gordy igniting a cultural revolution with a $700 loan, there have always been those who were just crazy enough to confound expectation and overcome long odds. It strikes me that sometimes crazy is just a word we use for don't know how and can't be done. And can't be done is, in turn, an expression that means never try to do it. Or worse, learn to accept it the way it is. I don't think David ever quite learned to accept. You hear it in his voice sometimes when he gets rolling in the pulpit. You sense that here is a man who has never quite figured out how to put on the armor that most of us wear on city streets, the emotional chainmail that allows us to walk without pain or pause past the bereft, the bereaved, the despicable, and the despised. There was once a time when more of us were like that, when most of us walked about unarmored. For all of the excesses of the 1960s, and they were considerable, the one thing I admire about that era is that the people in it lived with a sense of the possible, a sense that the power to make change, both personal and systemic, resided within each and every one. That sense, that optimism, has never quite seemed so general again. We have become more pragmatic in the intervening years, accustomed ourselves to lowered expectations and diminished skies. At a time when technology puts more power in the hands of the individual than ever before, we have paradoxically seemed to lose faith in the power of the one to move the many. David's crusade is quixotic, to be sure. I don't know if he will save 1,000 lives, or one, or none. I do know that it is exhilarating to watch him try, that it awakens in me something that demands to know what crazy things I've done lately. My answer is probably the same as yours, too few. I won't bore you with my excuses if you don't bore me with yours. Fact is, I see the same world the preacher sees. We all see the world the preacher sees. Yet, he toils in the name of change because he can't just stand by and do nothing. Meantime, we, many of us, sheathe our hearts in chainmail and pretend we do not see what we do. The preacher might be crazy, true. On the other hand, maybe we're just not crazy enough. That's the end of that column. Just not crazy enough. I was thinking about it this morning, and again, our history is replete with people who were crazy enough to feel that the things that other people might have interpreted as limitations were not in fact limitations, but maybe even spurs for them to go on and do impossible things. Oprah Winfrey started life as a poor black child from Mississippi who was the victim of childhood sexual abuse. Then we have a guy who grew up in Arkansas in an abusive and alcoholic home with a stepfather that he didn't get along with. He went on to become president of the United States, Bill Clinton. You look in the Bible and you have a guy who had a speech impediment, a stutter, and he's chosen by God to lead the children of God from Israel. You go back and there's to present-day history, and there's another guy who started life with a speech impediment, and he is considered one of the great speakers in American life, a gentleman named James Earl Jones. So it occurs to me that sometimes we obsess over our impediments and forget our possibilities. Everybody, you know, we talked about the issues of Bill Clinton's life, Oprah Winfrey's life, Moses' life, but the fact of the matter is everybody has something. Everybody has some sort of impediment. Everybody has something that they have to overcome. The difference between succeeding and not succeeding, I believe, is whether or not you allow that impediment to define you or whether you use it to spur you. A few months ago, I wrote a column in which I suggested that Lara Logan, the CBS newswoman who was sexually assaulted in Tahrir Square while reporting from Egypt, that she was deserving of our compassion, our empathy, and our prayers. That led me into a debate with some of my atheist readers over the existence of God. Some of them were they kind of took me by surprise, and it's really hard for readers to surprise me anymore, but it kind of took me by surprise how many people were offended that I suggested that she was deserving of our prayers. And I won't recount the whole debate with you, except to say that in the back and forth with some of those who had defined themselves as atheists, I came to understand that at least for some of them, what they meant was not that they had rejected God. I had a lot of people say to me, I pray to the universe, I pray to nature, I pray to whatever term they wanted to use, I pray to the intelligence above, you know, all intelligence, that they had not rejected God so much as they had rejected religion. A 2009 study, the American Religious Identification Survey by Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, backs up that impression. Among its findings, the number of people who call themselves Christian in this country stands at 76%, and that's down 10% since 1990. 30% of married couples did not have a religious ceremony, and better than 1 in 4 Americans does not expect to have a religious funeral. Not that belief in God has declined at all. A 2007 study by the Pew Forum found that 92% of all Americans believe in God. So no, people are not leaving God. They are leaving church. A distinction that was captured by the author Anne Rice last year when she wrote, quote, "Today I quit being a Christian. I remain committed to Christ as always, but not being Christian or being part of Christianity. It is simply impossible for me to belong to this disputatious, hostile, quarrelsome, and deservedly infamous group. For 10 years I've tried. I've failed. I'm an outsider. My conscience will allow nothing else." And me, you know, I understood where she was coming from. How many thieving televangelists, how many ministers of hatred, how many pedophile priests and clerical con men can organized faith produce before it begins to erode the foundations of trust without which it has no moral authority? How many times can people experience churches where concerns over committee meetings, budgets, and declining membership supersede the idea of saving souls and serving the larger world? How many times can people do that before they begin to lose the spark of inspiration that brought them to the church in the first place? Whatever the number is, it seems to me that we as in organized religion passed it a long time ago. But for all of the sins of organized religion, I think that one of the greatest is also one of the least discussed. Organized religion has this way of taking God and putting him into a box. It has this tendency to imprison him in the littleness of human imagination. I have written and spoken about this a number of times, so if you've read one of the columns or heard me give this speech before, I apologize for repeating myself. But we seem to have this idea of a God that we have created in our own image, a God who stretches only to the limitations of our likes and dislikes, our prides and our prejudices, a God who thinks as we think, who wants what we want, who sees what we see, and who does as we do, a God encoded with our jealousies and our lusts, our meanness and our hate, our pettiness, and our lies. A God who is just like you and me, only a little bit bigger. But that's the reason that I wanted those images on the screen for you, because to consider those images of the swirling cosmos is to recognize that if God is what we say God is, then God is God over all of that and an infinity more. He is the creator of creation itself, and therefore, by definition, he cannot be contained in the boxes that you and I construct for him. To ponder those images is to ponder the wisdom of Paul, who said he could do all things through Christ who strengthened him. It is to conclude that people of faith have been far too guilty for far too long of thinking far too small. And we live in a world, ladies and gentlemen, that desperately needs for us to think big. We live in a world where temperatures are rising, the icebergs are shrinking, and the snows are melting from Mount Kilimanjaro. We live in a world where little girls are routinely sold into sex slavery by impoverished families, and rape is a weapon of war. We live in a world where weapons of war proliferate from battlefields to city streets to schoolyards, and the sound of gunfire never stops. We live in a world where health is a function of how much money you have in your wallet, and illness is something too many people literally cannot afford. We live in a world where the language of hate, hatred of race, hatred of gender, hatred of sexual orientation, hatred of religion spews like sewage from your television, from your radio, and from the internet. We live in a world where the only thing that seems to be growing faster than poverty is the lack of compassion with which some people regard other people who are trapped in it. We live in a world where the inability to reason has become a badge of honor, and people are proud to parade their ignorance and call it truth. And perhaps most troubling of all, we live in a world where people have learned to say, this is just the way it is. These are realities that we have to accept. This is that things are what they are, what they were, and what they will be, and that the most foolish thing or credulous thing that you and I can do is to stand up and try to make a change. We live in a world where people believe that the ability of one or two, you or me, to change problems that are abiding and intractable, that to believe we can do that is to show yourself as naive and childish. Maybe that's the way they thought back in the 1960s, you know, but we are 11 years into the new millennium. We are bankrupt in more ways than one. Pragmatism has become our new watchword and our new religion, and idealism is something we can no longer afford. Again, that's what people say. And it occurs to me that maybe, you know, that we as people of faith have traveled a curious arc over the course of my individual lifetime. I find it odd to find myself in this world of lowered skies and shrunken expectation. I find myself wondering, was it really only less than 50 years ago when Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream"? Better question, why is it that there is always money enough for war? There is always money enough to give tax breaks to multinational corporations and multi-billion-dollar individuals. But there is never money enough to do anything about providing health care for some child growing up on the underside of the bottom. And here's the best question: what are people of faith going to do about it? I submit to you that the beginning of an answer comes with having the courage to imagine. In that column that I read you, I mentioned how Martin Luther King preached against the abiding and intractable issues of his age, that he threw his voice against a system of racial segregation and oppression that had been in place for the better part of a century, that was so ingrained in some hearts and minds that it was regarded as the natural order of things, and that he was victorious, a victory that we celebrate to this very day. But the thing that people forget about King is that he imagined so much more. We tend to think of him only as a civil rights leader, only as a black leader, but that actually does him a disservice. Recently, I had occasion to read his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, which was published in 1967. What was fascinating to me about that book was the broadness of King's scope, the width of his vision. He spoke of war, writing, quote, "It is not enough to say we should not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and to sacrifice for it." He wrote about education, promoting the idea of using non-professional teachers' aides to reduce class sizes, the need for an infusion of capital into poor schools, and the notion of replacing schools themselves with what he called educational parks. He spoke about the need for better housing, writing, quote, "It is too important to be left to private enterprise with only minor government effort to shape policy. We need the equivalent of a Medicare for housing." He spoke of poverty, declaring his support for a guaranteed income for the poor and a fundamental restructuring of the nation's economy and priorities. Now, my point in telling you all of that is not to analyze, argue with, agree, or disagree with any of the things that he proposed. My point, rather, is to tell you that I read all of this with my pragmatism hat on, because our pragmatism hat is sort of reflexive to us these days. So I had my pragmatism hat on, mentally checking off to myself how impossible all of his proposed solutions were. I found myself telling myself that that'll never happen. You know, they wouldn't even have gone for that back in the 1960s when the political environment was more favorable. You couldn't even mention such a thing right now. Fox News would have you for lunch. Over and over, I reflexively imposed limitations upon the things that Dr. King imagined. Over and over, I said to myself, the things he imagined could never happen. And of course, they did not happen. Dr. King was killed the next year before he could really even try. None of the things that he ever imagined came to pass. He failed. All that he managed to do with his life was to ignite a freedom movement that spread like fire, bringing down signs of segregation in every diner, bus station, bus, and church in this country. All he managed to do was to give energy and vision and voice to a peace movement that helped to bring an unjust war to an end. All that he managed to do was to ensure passage of the most important and far-reaching civil rights legislation in American history. All that he managed to do was to follow that up with voting rights legislation that unlocked the chambers of power for 2 generations of African American lawmakers and paved the way for the election of the first African American president. All that he managed to do was to force this nation to live up to face centuries of its own moral hypocrisy, its failure to even try to live up to the ideals upon which it was founded. All he managed to do was to call on America to act like America, or as he put it, quote, "be true to what you said on paper." That's all he did. That's all he did. And everything else he tried to do, he failed. And I'm reminded of a saying that we used to have back when I was a kid. Reach for the stars, reach for the moon, you might land among the stars. Now, yes, as a scientific matter, there's something a little bit wrong with that saying, because the stars are way beyond the moon. You get to the moon first, but take it in the sense in which it is meant, that you should always dream impossible dreams, knowing that even if you fail in your original goal, you may yet land and achieve something wondrous. I consider that expression that I grew up with. I consider the life of Dr. King, who did indeed land among the stars of the American experience, and I find myself wondering, when did our imaginations as people of faith become so shrunken and withered? When did pragmatism become an excuse for the failure or the inability or the refusal to dream impossible dreams? When did the children of a God big enough to fill the vastness that you saw on the screens behind me become convinced that they must settle for less? When did it become possible for a Glenn Beck to declare that preaching the social gospel, which for my money is the only gospel worth preaching, that preaching the social gospel was a sign of communism and totalitarianism? When did it become possible for him to say that and not be drowned out by the protests of people of faith who get up every day and work for the betterment of society? For the record, and as you may have guessed, my friend Reverend David Bowers did not make murder unknown in Washington, D.C. He failed in that. But guess what? In the year that I wrote that column about him, that city recorded 260 homicides. Last year, it recorded 130, a drop of 50%. I don't know that I give David credit for all of that. Surely community agencies, better policing, and local government had something to do with it. But I also think that a minister crazy enough to think he could solve an intractable problem, crazy enough to believe he could do all things through a Christ who strengthened him, was a major part of that success. I wish I had more stories like that to tell. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that it's too often the case in the last 20 years that the stories about people of faith that make the news usually find them in the service of some cause that is corrupt, hateful, hurtful, or just flat out beside the point. Think about it. What have been the biggest faith-related news stories of the last few years? You have that pastor here in Florida who burned the Koran. You have that church, and that should be in quotes, church in Kansas that protests at soldiers' funerals. You have that group that laid on the steps of the courthouse in Alabama to protest the removal of a rock bearing the Ten Commandments. You have the Catholic Church struggling to explain why it did not do more to protect children from pedophile priests. You have high-profile preachers who have stood up against gay rights being outed as gay themselves. Just once, I would like to turn on the news or fire up the internet and find a story about some preacher who got arrested demonstrating against cuts in programs that aid the homeless, mentally ill. Just once, I would like to see some group make up your mind. Just once, I would like to see some group of people of faith make the news because they drove some crack dealer off some corner where he sold the illusion of joy to people without hope. Just once, I would like to see some man or woman of God make headlines because they challenged economic injustice, labor exploitation, the bias of the criminal injustice system. Just once, I would like to see a news story that showed the body of Christ standing up for the despised, the disposed, the weak, the wretched, the vulnerable, the victimized. Just once. Just once, I would like to see TV news cameras capture some one of us acting in humble service to the poor as Christ did shortly before he was arrested. But that is not the faith that one seems to see most often these days. Rather, the faith that seems to rule the day is a faith of middle-class comforts and conservative pieties. It is a faith that is quiet on helping the poor or feeding the hungry, a faith you never hear much from until or unless some gay couple is getting married, or some frightened teenage girl is seeking an abortion, or some Muslim or a congregation is looking to build a mosque on land they own, or some black guy gets elected president. Then they scream and they holler and they demand their country back. Their country apparently being some idealized place where everything was in black and white. Trouble was a stranger. Mom and dad slept in separate beds in a house surrounded by picket fence. And Opie and the Beeve were always available for a game of stickball under the streetlights. I don't know about you, but I never knew that country. 2 years ago, the Pew Research Center released a study which, to my mind, spoke volumes about the quality of the faith practiced by those folks. According to the study, the more religious people claimed to be, the more likely they were to condone torture and the infliction of pain as means of interrogating suspected terrorists. Now, I find that an appalling finding under any circumstances, but what made it even more disturbing to me is that Christian people are, by definition, people who claim kinship with a Middle Eastern man who was tortured by the government and eventually executed even though he had committed no crime. You may have heard of him. He's a fellow named Jesus. His job description was Christ. Now, UCC, I recognize that in comparison with some of the other denominations, you are a smaller denomination, and perhaps news cameras do not find you as often as they find the Catholics and the Baptists. But I challenge you to live such that when they do find you, they find you living in authentic faith, a faith of service to humankind. Make sure that when they find you up to your knees in the muck and the mire of the nation's troubles, working and praying for change that other people deem impossible. Make sure they find you walking not in fear but in faith, as is justified for somebody whose Father is large enough to fill the spaces between the cosmos, but close enough to whisper in your ear. Make sure they find you worrying less about what is pragmatic and instead imagining possibilities that other people deem outlandish and unlikely. Imagine what might be possible if Christians rose en masse and told their lawmakers that it was intolerable to them that children in the wealthiest nation on the planet go to bed hungry every night. Imagine what might happen if Christians proficient in math, science, history, and biology volunteered to tutor failing students in failing schools, and every church on every corner suddenly became an educational park. Imagine how things might change if Christians identified the upkeep of God's creation as a duty of faith and challenged local corporations, government, and themselves to reduce their carbon footprint upon a fragile planet. Imagine how lives might be transformed if Christians decided that, you know what, heaven probably will not be separate but equal. If we decided that gay people and Muslim people and black people and Mexican people are also people, are also children of God, and offered church sanctuaries as places where people who were unalike could get together and break bread and maybe discover all the ways in which they are the same. Imagine how many lives might be saved if Christians declared health care an unalienable right and set up health care screenings in their churches, or taught preventative care to their congregations, or pressed their lawmakers to prioritize the wellness of the many ahead of the tax breaks for the wealthy few. Imagine how the pews might be filled to overflowing if Christians were able to say that here is a church that is not just about the 2 hours on Sunday, where indeed those 2 hours are just a pit stop to fill you up for the 166 other hours of the week spent trying to make a difference in a world where too many are weeping and too few care. Imagine how the entire world might be transfigured and transformed if we decided that our daddy has this whole world and the infinity in which it sits in the palm of his hand, and we begin to walk and talk in that sense of power and of purpose. Would we fail? Yes, definitely, certainly. We would fail spectacularly. We would fail repeatedly. We would fail like Reverend Bowers did, dropping murders in the nation's capital by only half. We would fail like Reverend King did, only managing to dismantle a system of oppression that had stood in place for almost a century. We would fail like Theodore Roosevelt failed, only managing to break up the trusts that fixed prices and shackled working men and women to lives of misery. We would fail like Cesar Chavez did, only managing to build a union that bettered the lives of men and women who toiled under an unforgiving sun and picked the grapes that the rest of us were able to snack on at our leisure. We would fail like Marva Collins did, only managing to produce scholars who were fluent in the language of Plato, Chaucer, and Pythagoras out of children, black and poor and from the inner city, that others had given up on as uneducable. None of those people that I named managed to achieve everything that they dreamt or that they imagined. All of them managed to fail, yet all of them managed to leave the world changed in profound and significant ways. Let us fail like them. Let us fail gloriously. Let us fail fearlessly, because only when you are prepared to fail fearlessly is there any hope of any kind of success. You know, I've spent most of this time here talking about the things that we imagine for ourselves. What do you think God imagined for us? When He breathed life into you and me, was it so that we could wallow in our inability, so that we could lower our expectations and call it pragmatism, so that we could accept a world of meanness and wrongness without trying to make it better? Or did He imagine that we might understand it as our sacred duty to care about one another, to take care of one another, to take hold of one another? Did He imagine that we might be brave enough, bold enough, and faithful enough that we might attempt to change the world? I leave you again that scientifically incorrect thing that we used to say when we were children. Reach for the moon, you just might land among the stars. The stars. Can you imagine? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pitts,